The glass wall. The fluorescent light of the adjunct history office hummed, a flat, metallic sound that Olivia had long learned to filter out. It was 11:30 p.m., the kind of quiet that clung to the fringes of a major university when the grants were gone and the ambition was sleeping. She was hunched over a stack of 19th-century diplomatic correspondence, her world defined by the meticulous, predictable lives of the dead. Her own life was modest, organized, and bitterly contained, a perfectly preserved ruin. A small, cheap desktop monitor in the corner, usually reserved for archival databases, glowed with the blinding, aggressive color of a national news broadcast. She rarely watched the news, but tonight she had sought it out, drawn by a masochistic need to witness the pinnacle of her ruin. There he was, Alex Sterling. The camera loved him. He stood on a stage framed by massive American flags, his tailored suit fitting like a second skin, his dark hair immaculately cut, silvering just enough at the temples to convey experience without sacrificing youth. He was giving a major address on economic policy, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that once whispered late-night promises in her ear. Now it resonated across the nation, commanding the kind of respect and attention she was denied. "We must acknowledge," Alex declared, leaning into the microphone with the perfect politician's practiced sincerity, "that our future success hinges on the echoes from the past, specifically the systematic analysis of institutional failure in the early 2000s, a concept I first introduced during my time in academia." Echoes from the past. It wasn't just a title. It was the entire intellectual scaffolding of her doctoral thesis, the 5 years of her life poured onto paper and bound with her sweat and tears. Hearing him say it now, so grandly, on a national stage, felt like a surgical incision without anesthesia. For years, Olivia had existed behind a glass wall of passive resentment. She could see the life she should have had, the recognition she deserved, but the invisible barrier kept her contained. Files, but for public financial records. The hunt had begun. The fateful day. The air in the graduate library's subterranean stacks always smelled of ozone and forgotten paper. But to 22-year-old Olivia, it smelled like possibility. This was where the collaboration thrived, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the shared manic energy of impending deadlines. Alex, leaning across the massive oak table, didn't look like a future political titan then. He looked like her equal, her conspirator. "Institutional amnesia," Alex muttered, running a finger over the title page of the final draft. "Echoes from the past, a systematic analysis of institutional failure." He grinned, that dazzling, infectious smile that had charmed her and every professor on the 3rd floor. "Olivia, this isn't just a thesis. This is a dissertation that changes the conversation. We're going to be legends." They had been inseparable partners in research, she the meticulous, deep-diving historian, he the eloquent, strategic theorist. They had built the argument block by block, spending sleepless nights tracing the obscure connections between post-war economic cycles and contemporary policy failures. But the actual writing, the synthesis of the data, the complex narrative structure, that was hers. The hard drive containing the only finalized copy was always on her desk. The fateful day wasn't marked by thunder or drama, but by a sudden, jarring silence. It was 3 hours before the submission deadline. Olivia had stepped out for 15 minutes to buy a celebratory bottle of cheap champagne. When she returned, the library cubicle was empty. Alex's backpack was gone. The hard drive, the blue-chipped external drive that held 5 years of their shared intellectual life, was missing from the charging station. A wave of dizzying panic hit her. She called him. No answer. She ran to his apartment, dark. A frantic text message. "Where are you, Alex? The deadline is in 2 hours." The next morning, the hammer fell. Olivia received an official summons from the dean's office, not to celebrate her submission, but to scholarship was immediately revoked. Her academic career, the future she had bled for, disintegrated, not with a bang, but with the cold, bureaucratic whisper of administrative dismissal. Alex, already celebrated as a genius, never took her calls. He was too busy accepting accolades, his smile now broadcast from campus newspapers, using her words to build his foundation. Standing there in the deserted dean's office, clutching the termination letter, Olivia didn't cry. The despair was too profound for tears. It was replaced by a hollow, consuming coldness. Alex hadn't just betrayed her friendship, he had stolen her identity. She left the university that day, a ghost walking away from her own grave, carrying one absolute truth: this debt will be paid. In full.
Chương 3. Khởi động cuộc săn.
The hunt didn't begin with a dramatic flourish or a clandestine confrontation. It began with a spreadsheet. The cold, logical grid of Excel was far more comforting to Olivia than human interaction, offering predictable constraints where life offered chaos. She had spent her entire academic career tracing the subtle influence of forgotten treaties and bankrupt corporations. Now, she would apply that same archaeological rigor to Alex Sterling's political and financial life. Her primary source documents were not brittle parchment, but the required public disclosure forms of a successful congressman. To the average constituent, the lists of investments and campaign donations were meaningless noise, a blur of acronyms and large, justified figures. But to Olivia, they were historical artifacts, demanding a close, meticulous read. She wasn't looking for obvious corruption. Alex was too smart for that. She was looking for patterns, for anomalies in the timeline, for the subtle misplaced semicolon that historical documents always contained. She cross-referenced Alex's publicly declared net worth with a series of known real estate purchases he made 5 years ago, right after his first major political ascent. A small, seemingly insignificant discrepancy appeared. A $50,000 variance in a land deal in South Carolina. It was too small to be headline news, perhaps just a simple reporting error. But why was the opaque limited liability company, the Palmetto Trust, handling the transaction dissolved exactly 6 meticulously sourced research paper? And she would not stop until her conclusion was irrefutable. Connecting the fragments. Olivia's apartment, typically cluttered with stacks of ungraded papers, had been reorganized into a command center of obsession. A corkboard dominated one wall, covered not with maps of past battlefields, but with photocopied forms, printed emails, and headshots of lobbyists connected by colored yarn. She had replaced the historical timeline with a chronological chart of Alex's political career. Each thread of yarn represented a transaction, a meeting, or a vote. The $50,000 discrepancy in the South Carolina land deal was the fragment she chose to follow. It was a lead so minute, so tedious that no investigative reporter would bother with it. But Olivia, the historian, knew that the smallest details often house the greatest secrets. She spent weeks digging into state-level records, databases that required subscription fees and patience. She discovered that the P.O. box shared by the Palmetto Trust wasn't random. It belonged to a small, low-profile lobbying firm in D.C., run by a woman named Eliza Thorne. Thorne was known for representing controversial, high-risk energy interests that Alex had publicly criticized but privately supported with his voting record. This was the pattern. A public gesture of virtue, Alex criticizing the energy sector, immediately followed by a quiet financial benefit, $50,000 linked to an energy lobbyist. Olivia started charting these contradictions in congruence. A major donation from a pharmaceutical CEO followed exactly 2 weeks later by Alex delaying a consumer protection bill. A 5-day personal trip to the Bahamas listed vaguely on his calendar, coinciding precisely with a regulatory hearing Alex publicly claimed to be too ill to attend. The private jet manifest records, obtained through a costly Freedom of Information Act request, showed that the plane belonged to the CEO of a company he regulated. Olivia began to sketch out a network graph on a large whiteboard, circles for people, squares for organizations, and arrows indicating the flow of money and influence. Alex Sterling was at the crucial high-growth years and had abruptly disappeared from the congressman's team 6 months prior. Alex's office had issued a boilerplate statement citing Thomas's pursuit of new opportunities in the private sector, but Olivia's research, digging through anonymous job board posts and DC gossip blogs, suggested the truth was far dirtier. Thomas had been pushed out after quietly expressing concerns about Alex's increasingly aggressive fundraising tactics. He was a dissenting footnote, silenced and discarded. Olivia found Thomas working a dreary, thankless job, managing logistics for a nonprofit in suburban Maryland. His LinkedIn profile was sparse, devoid of the glossy, ambitious language common among former congressional aides. He was hiding. That was the first point of contact, not through a phone call or a brazen office visit, but through the digital past. She crafted an email from a disposable account with the subject line so niche it would either be instantly deleted or intensely scrutinized. Inquiry regarding the 2007 Sunset Clause on the Interstate Commerce Act. The body of the email was brief, academic, and non-threatening. She introduced herself vaguely as an independent historical researcher focusing on early 21st century legislative drafting, citing Thomas's old and critically uncredited memo that dealt with the very clause Alex had used years ago to push through a dubious amendment. She wasn't asking about Alex, corruption, or scandal. She was asking about policy minutia, the kind of historical rabbit hole that only a true legislative nerd or someone deeply familiar with Alex's inner workings would recognize as significant. It was intellectual bait, appealing to the part of Thomas that still believed in policy over personality. 3 days later, Thomas replied. His response was wary, formal, and utterly captivated by the obscure details she had raised. He agreed to meet, but stipulated the time, 7 a.m., and the location, a bland, anonymous Starbucks nestled between a dry cleaner and a bank in a Virginia strip mall, far from the halls of power, a place where people stopped only out of necessity. Olivia arrived first, 45 minutes early, positioning herself at a corner table with a clear sightline to the entrance. She dressed in the neutral, slightly frumpy attire of an academic, no power suits, no expensive jewelry, projecting harmless intellectual curiosity. Resonance of a professor initiating a quiet seminar. She offered him a weak smile but didn't extend her hand. Physical touch invited immediate emotional complication, and she needed clinical detachment. They spoke for 10 minutes about the Sunset Clause, a tedious historical discussion designed purely to lower Thomas's defense mechanisms. Then, Olivia gently nudged the conversation past the historical artifact and toward the historian who currently owned the narrative. "I'm less interested in the clause itself," Olivia said, finally setting down the thick volume. Her eyes fixed on his. "And more interested in how history is written and who gets to hold the pen." Thomas froze, the foam on his latte going cold. His face, already pale, lost the last trace of color. I'm not sure I follow your research." "I think you do, Thomas," she stated simply, not as an accusation but as an observed fact. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The analysis of the Palmetto Trust and the $50,000 discrepancy she'd charted in Chapter 4. The raw data, elegantly visualized. She slid it across the table. This, for example, is a forgotten footnote in Congressman Sterling's 2020 finance report. The kind of thing only a staffer would handle. Thomas looked at the paper as if it might bite him. His hand started to tremble. "I know what Alex did to you, Thomas," Olivia continued, keeping her voice low, the words landing with the quiet finality of a gavel. "You tried to be honest. He punished you. That's his pattern. He steals intellectual property. He covers up financial irregularities, and when people speak up, he removes them. He learned that lesson very well early in his career, from my dissertation." She paused, allowing the silence to fill with the weight of both their ruined pasts. "I'm not here to threaten you, Thomas. I'm here because I'm finishing a research project. The difference between you and me is that you saw the present, and I places where the lighting was poor and the crowds were transient, a lonely bench in Rock Creek Park, the rarely used mezzanine of the Georgetown Library, and finally, the back corner of a dusty used bookstore specializing in political science failures. Each meeting peeled back a layer of Thomas's defense. Olivia never pushed, never used coercion. She employed the quiet patience of a historian deciphering a broken cipher. She listened. Thomas, haunted by the moral erosion he had witnessed, finally began to confess, not to a conspirator, but to an impartial auditor of human folly. He spoke of the early days of Alex's congressional run, how the initial campaign had been grossly mismanaged, leaving Alex buried under a mountain of undisclosed campaign debt, a debt so significant it would have immediately disqualified him from office had it been revealed. "He was desperate," Thomas admitted on the library mezzanine, his voice barely a breath above the rustle of old paper. "We needed $75,000 instantly to silence a few small creditors who were about to leak. That's when the big money came in. The donor. Not the pharmaceutical guy, but the one no one ever talks about. A holding company based out of Delaware, tied to some seriously questionable overseas interest. Alex took the money, funneled it through 3 shell corporations in 3 months. That was the first true sellout. He covered the debts, but he opened the secret door to his soul. Once he stepped through, he couldn't close it." Olivia nodded slowly, connecting Thomas's narrative to the threads on her whiteboard. The Delaware Holding Company, it explained the Palmetto Trust connection and the untraceable movement of the $50,000. It wasn't just corruption, it was extortion. Alex was indebted, owned by a donor whose interests were clearly toxic. "I tried to keep copies of everything," Thomas whispered, staring into the dark corner of the library ceiling. "Just in case. I knew what he was doing. When he fired me, he did a forensic sweep of my computer, but he missed the obvious place. The old office supply closet. I hid it in plain sight." The final handover was arranged for a rainy Saturday afternoon in an otherwise deserted commuter parking garage. The setting was Jet Company demanded it. "The real echoes are in here." Olivia's fingers brushed the cold metal of the box. The weight of it was immense, the physical manifestation of a decade of injustice. "And the thesis?" Thomas's eyes, full of pain, finally met hers. "The thesis wasn't the worst of it. It was the prologue. I found his old voice recorder. Alex used to dictate thoughts late at night. There's a file from that week. He's drunk, gloating about submitting the paper, and then he mentions you. by name. He laughs. He says he taught little Livy that the only research that matters is the one you brand with your own name. That was the crucial piece, the audio confession, hard proof not just of financial crime, but of the intellectual theft that had destroyed her life. The final, damning evidence of his character, spoken by his own triumphant, traitorous voice. "You've done the right thing, Thomas," Olivia said, her voice steady and professional, betraying none of the seismic shift occurring inside her. She didn't offer comfort or absolution. She offered validation. "The historical record will be corrected." Thomas merely nodded, his eyes hollow. He had surrendered his burden, but the fear remained. He drove away, disappearing back into the anonymity she had helped him preserve. Olivia sat in her car, the lockbox heavy in her lap, listening to the rain fall against the concrete. The hunt was over. The excavation was complete. Now the analysis, the framing, and the public presentation of the evidence could begin. The secret door was closed, and the path to Alex Sterling's downfall was clear. Decoding the treasure. The old metal lockbox sat on Olivia's worn oak desk, an unremarkable object containing the potential destruction of a national political star. The air in her small study was chilled, not just by the late hour, but by the sheer, contained malevolence emanating from the box. Olivia, dressed in a faded sweatshirt and surgical gloves, the historian's equivalent of battle armor, approached it with the reverence and detachment due an ancient, volatile artifact. She used a small precision scanner, originally intended for digitizing fragile public disclosure forms with the private transactions. The lines of deception, once faint, now glowed in garish red. He didn't even try hard to hide the payoff, she thought, a grim satisfaction curling her lips. He became so arrogant in his success, he assumed the paper trail would be buried by his status, not unearthed by a woman he dismissed as Little Livy. Tier 2 comprised the internal memos. These were a study in the euphemisms of corruption. A memo titled "Streamlining Regulatory Clarity for the Energy Sector" was actually a direct instruction from Alex to Thomas to indefinitely postpone a consumer safety hearing. Another, labeled "Strategic Scheduling Review," documented Alex's private jet trip to the Bahamas with the CEO whose company he was regulating. The documents didn't just prove Alex was corrupt. They proved he was a hypocrite, using the language of policy for personal profit. But it was Tier 3, the smallest file, that held the true emotional power. It was an audio file from Alex's forgotten voice recorder, dating back to the night before the fateful submission deadline 10 years ago. Olivia plugged in a pair of studio-quality headphones, bracing herself for the sound of his voice. The file began with the sound of ice clinking and a heavy sigh. Then Alex's voice, slurred and triumphant. "That's it. Submitted. Done." Dad handled the paperwork for the name change. Echoes from the past. Sounds damn important, right? Too bad little Livy thinks she's getting half the credit. She doesn't understand the game. The smart ones do the research. The strategic ones, we own the damn narrative. She'll fade out. I'll be on cable news by 30. History is written by the winners, darling. And tonight, I won. A short, sharp, ugly laugh followed, a sound that had been ringing in Olivia's ears for a decade without her knowing its true source. Olivia didn't flinch. She didn't rage. She simply listened to the file 5 more times, transcribing the exact phrasing of the confession, marking the timestamps, and then digitally reinforcing the audio to decode it. Alex Sterling wasn't just guilty, he was historically, financially, and personally exposed. The meticulous scholar had provided the absolute foundation for the execution. The trap was set. All that remained was choosing the moment and pulling the trigger. Choosing the stage. The master dossier lay inert on Olivia's desk, a 50-page document bound not by tape or plastic, but by the cold, dense truth of its data. It was ready to be deployed, a historical indictment waiting for its moment. Olivia knew that a file this damaging couldn't just be anonymously leaked to a low-tier blogger or a cable news producer. That would only invite the political machine to discredit the messenger and smother the truth. The impact had to be instantaneous, undeniable, and, most importantly, televised. She needed a convergence point, a place where Alex's two stolen worlds, academic prestige and political power, collided. She began meticulously tracking his public schedule, not for routine press conferences, but for events of symbolic importance. The perfect opportunity materialized: the Founders Circle Policy Gala, hosted by the Rockwell Institute, a prestigious, nonpartisan think tank known for shaping the national dialogue. This year, the event was being held in the grand ballroom of the hotel adjacent to the very university where Alex had first presented his fraudulent thesis, a symbolic return to the scene of the crime. The keynote speaker, Congressman Alex Sterling. The event's theme was an exquisite piece of cosmic irony: integrity in the digital age, how transparency builds trust. The guest list was a tactical dream. The dean of the political science department who had signed her dismissal papers, major corporate donors linked to the very Delaware holding company in Tier 1, and, critically, a rotating pool of DC's most powerful political journalists, columnists, and investigative reporters. The media pit alone would ensure global distribution. This wasn't just a speech, it was Alex's self-coronation as a future party leader. This was the stage. Olivia began formulating her deployment strategy. It could not be a simple email blast. The data needed to hit the room, the press pool, and the internet simultaneously. She would use the environment itself as her weapon. First, Wi-Fi network for the attendees, but also a dedicated, slightly less secure network for the press. Olivia's plan was complex but elegant, relying on old-school networking physics. She purchased a tiny, powerful wireless broadcast device, a digital Trojan horse. She planned to load the entire master dossier onto the device and configure it to impersonate the event's press Wi-Fi network exactly 1 minute before Alex took the stage. Once the journalists' and attendees' phones automatically connected to the rogue network, the device would begin mass airdropping the dossier to every nearby device, masked as a program update. The sheer volume and speed of the data dump would overwhelm the local network, guaranteeing rapid dissemination before security could isolate the source. She spent the weeks leading up to the gala practicing the deployment, timing the insertion of the device, and perfecting the anonymity protocols. Her calm was unnerving. The meticulous planning drained the last vestiges of emotion from the task. She wasn't seeking retribution in the heat of passion. She was correcting a decade-old historical error with the precision of a Swiss clockmaker. Standing in her dark study, looking at the date circled on the calendar, the night of the Founders Circle Policy Gala, Olivia felt the shift in her identity complete. She was no longer a victim seeking justice. She was a historical corrective, the mechanism by which the narrative of Alex Sterling would be violently revised. The stage was set, the evidence prepared, and the weapon, her intellectual rigor, was fully loaded. She had chosen her moment not for maximum cruelty, but for maximum historical impact. With only 72 hours remaining, Olivia's fairest but the most psychologically subtle part of her plan. the final warning. It wasn't meant to save Alex, nor was it a moral obligation. It was a carefully calculated tactical move designed to generate 3 outcomes: confirm Alex's physical presence at the event, rattle his composure just before the performance, and ensure he would be too panicked to notice the sophisticated digital trap closing around him. She used a secure, untraceable burner phone purchased months ago and a prepaid data card. The institutional memory is fading, Alex, but the greatest failures are those history is too inconvenient to record. See you Friday night. LJ. The initials LJ stood for Livy Jones, the diminutive nickname he had sneeringly used on the night he recorded his confession. Olivia didn't wait for a response. She immediately destroyed the phone, shattering the SIM card and battery with a small steel hammer, the action feeling less violent than necessary and more cathartic than she could have imagined. The next 48 hours in Alex Sterling's orbit were, predictably, chaos. Alex was in the middle of a high-stakes interview prep session when his phone buzzed. He glanced down, and the blood instantly drained from his face. His carefully constructed political mask fractured, revealing a raw, naked panic his staff had never witnessed. "Who the hell is LJ?" he barked, clutching the phone as if it were a live wire. He tried to call the number back. Service unavailable. He forwarded the message to his chief of staff, Marcus. Marcus, a pragmatic political operator, was baffled. LJ? Sir, is this an old girlfriend? A lobbyist? The line is just a bit of philosophical nonsense. Nonsense! That's not nonsense, Marcus. That's from the damn dissertation! Alex paced his office, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair until it stood on end. That's a direct quote from the introductory chapter, a throwaway line I used to set the tone. Nobody knows that quote except for the people in that room 10 years ago. And Livy Jones. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. He hadn't thought of her in years, choosing instead to believe she had simply disappeared into the obscurity he had forced upon her. The thought that she was still out there, still holding a grudge, still remembering, was terrifying. He realized the threat wasn't the quote. The threat was the memory itself. Alex became manic. He ordered his security team to sweep the upcoming gala location, checking for bugs, physical threats, dismantled by a single 10-word sentence. Olivia, watching the resulting chaos manifest in minor scheduling changes and agitated staff memos, all of which she tracked through her peripheral press sources, smiled thinly in the dark. She hadn't fired a shot, but she had achieved her objective. She had confirmed Alex would be there, and she had ensured that when the real attack came, he wouldn't be looking at the digital payload. He'd be looking over his shoulder for a ghost. The final act was ready to begin. The night of the stage. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel was a symphony of power and pretense. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, deceptive glow over 200 of Washington, D.C.'s elite. Policymakers, corporate lobbyists, and the political press corps, identifiable by their weary, practiced expressions. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, stale ambition, and the faint, metallic tang of the evening's catering, a perfect atmosphere for a grand deception. Olivia, disguised in a sharp, forgettable gray pantsuit and wearing the press badge for the obscure academic blog she'd fabricated, blended seamlessly into the press section. She was a footnote, an observer, the role she had been forced to play for a decade, but tonight it was a costume. She sat at a table near the back, directly facing the stage, her posture relaxed, her eyes focused yet distant, the picture of professional detachment. Beneath the linen tablecloth, her hands were busy. She retrieved the digital Trojan horse from her bag, a device no larger than a key fob, connected to a power bank that would give it roughly 5 minutes of high-intensity broadcast time. Using a tiny stylus and a secure interface, she initiated the final sequence. The device activated, silently mimicking the name and security protocols of the hotel's Rockwell Press Wi-Fi. The laptops and phones of dozens of journalists, programmed to prefer familiar networks, instantly began connecting to the rogue signal. 1 minute until broadcast, she timed in her mind. A ripple of polite applause signaled the introduction. Congressman Alex Sterling ascended the stage, looking every bit the future presidential contender. Immaculate tuxedo, silver-flecked hair, and a smile that radiated confidence. Fingers hovering over the launch key. She waited for the perfect narrative hook, the moment of maximum hypocrisy. Alex leaned into the microphone, launching into the night's theme. Integrity in the digital age. How transparency builds trust. "We live in a world," he declared, his voice ringing with false sincerity, "where the most fundamental commodity is trust. We must demand that our leaders provide absolute transparency, that they lay bare the facts, the data, the history that informs their decisions." Now, Olivia thought. She initiated the digital broadcast. The key fob began to blink a steady, silent blue. Instantly, the master dossier, the financial ledgers, the internal memos, the color-coded spreadsheets, and the damning audio file began transferring to every connected device in the room. The data dump was disguised as an urgent security update, forcing a flash download onto laptops and phones in the press section and the main floor. Before anyone could process the strange notification on their screens, Olivia took the second theatrical step. She reached into her blazer and produced a small, high-powered directional laser pointer, the kind historians use for massive, high-ceilinged lecture halls. She aimed it not at Alex, but at the main 10-foot-tall projection screen behind him, currently displaying the Rockwell Institute's logo. She aimed and clicked. The laser projection, a stark, bold font, flashed onto the screen just as Alex was reaching the crescendo of his opening remarks. Rockwell Institute announcement. The laser pointed to a URL, archives-revisited.org/echoes. Alex faltered mid-sentence. His eyes, trained by years of political maneuvering to track every anomaly, immediately fixed on the screen behind him. He didn't understand the URL, but the word echoes hit him like a physical blow. His face went white, losing all the TV makeup and political polish. "What is that?" he whispered into the microphone, the sound carrying across the stunned ballroom. The audience didn't hear him, though. They were too busy staring at their phones. The journalists in the theft and the betrayal. The ballroom exploded. Gasps turned to shouts. Phones clattered onto tables as stunned attendees began scrolling through the PDF of the master dossier, the evidence of financial crime, regulatory malfeasance, and intellectual fraud, all presented with the irrefutable clarity of historical fact. Alex stood paralyzed on the stage, the light from the overhead spots burning him like a harsh interrogation lamp. The ghost he had been looking for wasn't in the room. She was in the data. He saw Olivia's face flash briefly in the distance, calm and unremarkable in the press section, before she turned and silently, professionally, began her retreat. The audio clip of Alex's drunken boast repeated 3 times before the young journalist managed to silence his phone. But the damage was irreversible. The sound, raw, unscripted and perfectly timed with the congressman's speech on integrity, was the match that ignited the historical archive. The firestorm. The ballroom instantly ceased to be a respectful policy forum and devolved into a chaotic media scrum. The chandeliers seemed to flicker, not from electrical fault, but from the sudden, frenetic energy. Journalists, recognizing a career-defining scoop, sprang up simultaneously, their focus shifting violently from the man on the stage to the screens in their hands. The collective noise was deafening. The rapid, percussive click of camera shutters, the aggressive voices of reporters shouting questions, and the frantic, hushed tones of Alex's staff desperately trying to restore order. Alex remained frozen at the podium. His mind, the political calculator that had always worked 5 steps ahead, had jammed. The sheer impossibility of the moment, the convergence of his deepest, darkest secret with his brightest, most public stage, had rendered him inert. He was not just caught, he was historically indicted in real time. The look on his face was not one of defiance, but of agonizing, profound recognition. He knew LJ was here, and he knew, instinctively, that this was the cost of the debt she had promised to collect. His chief of staff, Marcus, a man whose skin was usually impermeable to crisis, looked sick. Including one CEO whose name was visibly linked to the Delaware holding company, were scrambling for the exits, their elegant composure shattered. The dean of the political science department, who had dismissed Olivia a decade ago, stood by his table, staring at the financial ledgers on his phone, his face a grotesque mask of shock and dawning culpability. The data spreads. Outside the hotel, Olivia was already several blocks away, walking briskly toward a prearranged exit point. She did not need to watch the collapse. She could feel the shockwave. The master dossier, meticulously structured, was doing its work. Within 30 minutes, the hashtag Echoes from the Past was trending nationally. The evidence was undeniable because it was not hearsay. It was primary source documentation. Tier 1, Financial Crime. The wire transfers and ledger entries were being dissected live on cable news, proving a clear quid pro quo that violated campaign finance laws and constituted bribery. Tier 2, Ethical Malfeasance. The internal memos were fueling instant outrage on social media, a politician railing against corporate greed while actively working to delay consumer protection laws for the very corporations funding him. Tier 3, The Confession. The audio clip, stripped of its visual context, went viral, not as evidence of a crime, but as a chilling indictment of Alex's character. His own words, "We own the damn narrative," became the perfect epitaph for his career. The Quiet Retreat. Olivia found a small, quiet bar 2 neighborhoods away. She ordered a ginger ale, resisting the urge to check the news, focusing instead on the feel of the cool glass in her hand. She had planned for triumph, but what she felt was a profound cold completion. There was no joy, no giddy elation of victory. The moment of revenge was purely academic, a hypothesis proven, a historical error corrected. The decade of bitterness had been channeled into a single perfect act of analytical destruction, leaving behind an emotional vacuum. She had spent so long building the trap, she hadn't considered what it felt like to be outside of it. It was not fire she felt, but the calm, residual chill of glacial ice. She had seen Alex's face when the audio played, the look of utter, immediate defeat. It was the only violations of integrity. Alex Sterling's fall was not a slow slide. It was a vertical, catastrophic collapse under the weight of his own documented hypocrisy. He had owned the narrative for a decade, but now the archives were fighting back, and the historian had ensured that the truth, meticulously sourced and timed, would be the final, indelible echo of his career. 6 months had passed since the night of the Founder Circle Policy Gala, and the geopolitical debris from Congressman Alex Sterling's collapse had settled into the quiet, ugly reality of legal documents and resignation letters. His downfall was swift and absolute, less a tragic opera and more a bureaucratic execution. He resigned 3 days after the gala, citing immediate health concerns, a predictable lie swallowed by the truth of the master dossier. The ethics investigation quickly escalated into a Department of Justice probe, fueled by the irrefutable primary source evidence that Olivia had provided. The wire transfers, the memos, and his own recorded confession ensured there was no narrative spin left to save him. Alex Sterling, the man who had built an empire on the phrase "echoes from the past," was now destined to become one of history's footnotes. A cautionary tale filed neatly under corruption, hubris, and self-destruction. For Olivia, the period following the leak was characterized by a cold, welcome quiet. She had carefully chosen not to become a talking head, not to be drawn into the punditry that would have turned her revenge into cheap theater. Her triumph was not loud. It was scholarly. She spent those 6 months doing what she did best, writing. She didn't write fiction or even a memoir. She wrote an academic, non-fiction book that leveraged the vast, authenticated data from the master dossier. She returned to the title she had rightfully earned a decade ago, but refined and expanded by her experience. The result was Echoes from the Past: How Political Amnesia Enables Modern Corruption. The book was a critical and commercial success. It was not a revenge tract, but a meticulously sourced historical analysis of the political She had accepted a prestigious 1-year fellowship at a prominent policy institute, a temporary position, on her own terms, one that paid her fairly and gave her the freedom to choose her next move. She picked up the hardback copy of her book from the desk. The cover was simple, black, with the gold lettering of the title, and beneath it, in clear, bold font, by Dr. Olivia Jones. The sight of her name, finally validated by her own work, was more satisfying than any public apology or criminal conviction could ever be. The debt was paid. The intellectual property was recovered. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from the university dean's office. Not the dean who had dismissed her, but his newly installed successor. It was a formal, flowery apology, offering her a tenured professorship track beginning the following fall, citing her unprecedented contributions to political transparency and historical integrity. Olivia smiled thinly, a genuine smile that finally reached her eyes. She didn't need their tenure, and she didn't need their absolution. She had proven her thesis on a national stage. She typed a polite but non-committal response. She looked out at the city, a vast, intricate landscape of ambition and data. She hadn't destroyed Alex out of blind fury. She had corrected a historical error. The historian in her was at peace. She had turned the page, and the new chapter was entirely her own. She closed the book, ready to begin the next piece of research, whatever that might be. The only sound in the office was the quiet hum of her laptop, ready for the next archive.